In 1521, the King of France, Francis I, sent an Italian-born explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano to explore the region between Florida and Newfoundland for a route to the Pacific Ocean. 4 ships were commissioned and funded, and set off in 1522, but a violent storm destroyed 2 and forced the rest to return to Brittany. The 2 remaining ships tried again in 1523, but one of the ships only made it as far as Madeira before turning back. In the end, only a single ship, with a crew of 50 men, made the passage. And while there was no route to the Pacific to be found, Verrazzano did find parts of what is now New York Harbor, allowing the French to claim what is now much of Queens and Brooklyn in New York City. Verrazzano named the area Nouvelle Angoulême, after King Francis, who before becoming king had been the Count of Angoulême. But despite Verrazzano's encouragement, the French did little to colonize the area, allowing it to fall into Dutch control in 1609. Instead, the French turned to focus on the north, when in 1534 an expedition led by Jacques Cartier began the first of what would be 3 journeys down the St. Lawrence River into what is now Canada. In 1541, 400 settlers arrived in an effort to establish a permanent colony around what is now Quebec City, but a combination of bad weather and conflicts with Native Americans forced them to largely abandon the settlement. Later, far to the south, in 1562, a Huguenot leader by the name of Gaspard de Coligny attempted to set up a military fort on Paris Island in what is now South Carolina. They named the fort the Charlesfort. The navigator of the mission, Jean Revolt, left the captain and 28 men on the island to build a settlement, with the intention of returning the next year with additional supplies. But when the ship returned to France, the navigator discovered that a war between the Huguenot Protestants and the French Catholics had broken out. Revolt was caught giving aid to Huguenots and was forced to flee to England, where he was arrested before he could return to the colony with supplies. But in his absence, the colony grew desperate. Their remaining supplies had burned in a fire, and the captain reportedly lost the trust of his men after ordering one killed and another, a man by the name of Lacher, temporarily banished to a nearby island with no supplies. The remaining crew mutinied, killing the captain. They rescued Lacher, and the crew built their own ship to sail back to England. They had no compass, and the ship was more or less makeshift. One person decided he had a better chance to stay at the island by himself than go along with the crew. And it turns out he wasn't wrong. After 3 weeks at sea, they had only traveled 86 miles, and it was clear the supplies they had would not last. They were forced to resort to cannibalism before being rescued by an English ship. By pure chance, on board that English ship was the second in command to the ship that had returned to get supplies. His name was René de Laudinière. He interviewed the men, and he wrote a report saying, quote, "Wherefore, in this extreme despair, certain among them made this motion, that it was better that one man should die than that so many men should perish. They agreed, therefore, that one should die to sustain the others. Which thing was executed in the person of Lacher, of whom we have spoken heretofore, whose flesh was divided equally among his fellows, a thing so pitiful to recite that my pen is loath to write it." Soon after his crewmates left, the person who stayed at the Charlesfort was captured by Spanish soldiers from Cuba and taken to Havana. The Charlesfort was then named Santa Elena by its new Spanish owners. 2 years later, in 1564, Laudinière brought 200 more settlers across the Atlantic to attempt to establish a settlement in what is now Jacksonville, calling it Fort Caroline. Most accounts agree that the settlers were very dependent on the Native American Tumucua tribe for food and supplies, and that the Tumucua were able to convince the settlers to aid them in raids against their rivals in exchange for this food. But even that was not enough to make the colony successful. In 1565, an English slave trading expedition led by a man by the name of John Hawkins arrived seeking fresh water. Instead, he was able to make a deal where he would give the settlers the smallest ship and provisions in exchange for cannons. The French also gave Hawkins tobacco, which many in the settlement had begun using regularly. Hawkins took it back to England, likely being one of the first introductions of the product. The French settlers intended to use the ship and provisions to abandon the fort and return to France. But by that point, Revolt had been released from custody and returned to the area with a resupply fleet and hundreds of soldiers in August of 1565. The Spanish also had a fort in the area about 35 miles away at St. Augustine, and they sent troops to remove the French fort, likely not realizing reinforcements had arrived. After a brief fight, the Spanish ships were forced to retreat back to St. Augustine, with the French in pursuit. Unfortunately for the French, their pursuing ships were caught in a violent storm which lasted for several days. It ended up destroying much of their fleet and removing most of their survivors near what is now Daytona Beach. The Spanish sent a force by land to attack the now lightly manned Fort Caroline, capturing it and killing most of those who remained at the settlement. The Spanish then sent forces to capture the marooned French soldiers. The Spanish force who arrived were outnumbered by the French, but the French had no food or water. After negotiation, the French survivors agreed to surrender. Reportedly, they were taken 10 at a time to a dune where a boat awaited, and were told, quote, "Gentlemen, I have but a few soldiers with me, and you are many, and it would be an easy matter for you to overpower us and avenge yourselves upon us for your people, which we have killed in the fort. For this reason it is necessary that you should march to my camp 4 leagues from here, with your hands tied behind your backs." The French, having no choice, allowed themselves to be restrained. They were taken by boat to the mainland, where they were asked if they were Catholics. Those who were not were killed. This included Verrazzano himself. In response to the French inquiry for mercy, the leader of the Spanish force, Pedro Mendez de Alves, wrote to the Spanish king that he said, quote, "I answered him that we had taken their fort and killed all the people in it, because they had built it there without your majesty's permission, and were disseminating the Lutheran religion in these your majesty's provinces, and that I, as captain general of these provinces, was waging a war of fire and blood against all who came to settle these parts and plant in them their evil Lutheran sect. For I was come at your majesty's command to plant the gospel in these parts, to enlighten the natives in those things which the Holy Mother Church of Rome teaches and believes, for the salvation of their souls. For this reason I would not grant them safe passage, but would sooner follow them by sea and land until I had taken their lives." Some French, likely realizing the situation, were able to escape. Of them, Menendez wrote, quote, "The other people with Verrazzano, some 70 or 80 in all, took to the forest, refusing to surrender unless I grant them their lives. These and 20 others who escaped from the fort, and 50 who were captured by the Indians, from the ships which we wrecked, in all 150 persons, rather less than more, are all the French alive today in Florida, dispersed and flying through the forest, and captive with the Indians. And since they are Lutheran, and an order that is so evil a sect shall not remain alive in these parts, I will conduct myself in such wise, and I will so incite my friends the Indians on their part, that in 5 or 6 weeks very few, if any, will remain alive. And of 1,000 French, with an armada of 12 sail, who had landed when I reached these provinces, only 2 vessels have escaped, and those very miserable ones, with some 40 or 50 persons in them. The area where all this occurred is now referred to as Matanzas Inlet, Matanzas meaning slaughter in Spanish. But the French didn't entirely give up on North America. In 1598, the French attempted to set up a trading post on Sable Island on the coast of Nova Scotia, but that also failed. In 1600, they tried again in what is now Quebec, but only 5 settlers were able to survive the winter. Between 1604 and 1613, various settlements were attempted and abandoned, until finally in 1608, Quebec was founded, with only 28 men. Growth of the settlement was slow, with only 85 French settlers in 1627, 2 years before English privateers plundered the city. But in 1640, the population was 355, and a true foothold was established. One of the founders of the settlement, Samuel de Champlain, allied the group with the Algonquins and the Innu people who were in conflict with the Iroquois. French assistance and weaponry were seen as invaluable in this conflict, and set up strong trade in furs, which were coveted in Europe, where the European beaver had been hunted to near extinction. Boys from the settlement were often encouraged to live among the allied native tribes in order to learn the language and customs so they could become translators. These boys came to be known as coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods, and through these connections the French were able to make alliances with the Huron, but were still in general conflict with the Iroquois. As the British colonies in the south were growing much more quickly, an advisor to King Louis XIII by the name of Cardinal de Richelieu founded the Compagnie de Nouvelle France, which came to be known in English as the Company of 100 Associates. The company offered land parcels to hundreds of settlers so long as they were Catholic. Those Protestants already living in the area were either subjected to forced conversion or to relocate to English settlements. But the offer of land grants had limited success. By 1650, there were still only around 700 colonists in New France, and the settlement was so weak that it nearly fell to the Iroquois in 1660. King Louis XIV decided additional investment was needed, and so the king took away control of the Company of 100 Associates and made the area a royal province. The crown offered more incentives to move, and paid for transatlantic passages. They also set up a royal garrison in Quebec in 1665. But one of the biggest challenges of the colony was the lack of women. So they set up a program to encourage single women between the ages of 15 and 30 to move to the colony. These became known as the filles du roi, or king's daughters. Between 1664 and 1673, between 770 and 850 of these women were given free passage and what was functionally a dowry paid by the king to relocate to the colonies. Although most of the women were commoners, they were not selected at random, but had to be certified as both morally and physically fit, usually by a priest. Most were urban, with about half from Paris. Many were orphans, and virtually all were very poor, although a few came from previously elite families that had fallen on hard times. The program was viewed as a huge success, as records show that at least 737 marriages linked to king's daughters, and by 1671, at least 700 children had been born as a result. By 1672, the population of New France had reached 6,700, and reportedly two-thirds of all Canadians of French descent can trace their lineage to one of the king's daughters. In 1682, a French explorer by the name of René Robert Cavelier led an expedition that explored the Ohio River Valley, going down the Mississippi and claiming the entire region for France, renaming it La Louisiane after the king. In 1685, he attempted to establish Fort St. Louis in what is now Texas, not realizing that due to the bad maps, he was probably intruding on Spanish claims. A member of the expedition wrote of the area when he arrived in February of 1685, quote, "The country did not seem very favorable to me. It was flat and sandy, but nevertheless covered with grass. There were several small lakes. We didn't see much wildfowl, except for a few sandhill cranes or geese that weren't expecting us." This proved to be true, as between violent encounters with local people, disease, starvation, and exhaustion, around half of the party died by the end of July. By January of 1687, only 45 of the 180 remained, and the survivors were often fighting among themselves. Cavelier himself was murdered while investigating the murder of one of his nephews, and when the Spanish found what was left of the fort in 1688, it was reportedly abandoned and in ruins after the attack by the Karankawa. 3 bodies were found, and after the Spanish priests held funerals, the fort was burned. The following year, Spanish in the area received a parchment that had a drawing of a ship and a letter from one of the few survivors. The letter stated, quote, "I don't know what kind of people you are. We are French. We live among savages. We prefer to live among Christians such as ourselves. Our only grievance is to be among beasts like them, who believe neither in God nor in anything. My lords, if it pleases you to take us, all you have to do is send us a message. We will deliver ourselves to you." In total, 15 survivors were located by the Spanish. Most had abandoned the colony prior to final attack. The only survivors who stayed at the colony were 4 children, all siblings from the Talon family, who were spared and adopted by the Karankawas. These 4 children were by this point tattooed, as was the custom of the Karankawas. They, along with a 5th child who was separately located, were taken to Mexico City, where they were made servants. 2 had forgotten their native French. Later attempts at settlements had better luck. In 1686, Henri de Tonty established a trading post in what is now Arkansas. In 1689, a Jesuit mission was set up near abandoned mounds created by a Native American people in the area hundreds of years prior. The settlement, named after the Cahokia, became one of the largest French settlements in the area, reaching a population of around 3,000 people. Far to the south, in 1699, an expedition built a fort near what is now Biloxi, Mississippi. In 1701, Detroit was founded. In 1702, La Mobile was founded in what is now Mobile, Alabama. In 1715, Louis XIV passed away. His will made his then 5-year-old great-grandson, King Louis XV, and Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, regent. Louis XIV had left a financial mess behind, and the regent was looking for a way to balance the budget. He became friends with a Scottish banker by the name of John Law. Law convinced the Duke of Orleans to allow him to open a bank, which would issue paper banknotes, initially backed by silver or gold. In 1717, Law was given control over the trade between France and its colonies in Louisiana and Canada for 25 years in exchange for Law promising to transport 6,000 settlers and 3,000 slaves during that period. With this new power, Law created the Compagnie d'Occident, or Company of the West, and he began selling shares in what came to be known as the Mississippi Company. In 1718, New Orleans was founded, named after the regent. Law's company bought 800 settlers that year, which doubled the total European population of the area. And in 1719, Law began sending prisoners from Paris, encouraging them to marry young women he had recruited from orphanages and hospitals. A historian at the King's Library at the time wrote of the event, quote, "In the priory of the church of Sainte Marie des Champs in Paris were married 184 ladies, with as many boys, ones that had been taken from the prisons of that priory and other prisons of the town, after having allowed the poor girls to choose their husbands from a large number of boys. After the ceremony, they were chained 2 by 2, the husband with his wife, followed by 3 carts with their clothes and provisions, in order to carry the sick, escorted by 20 archers, taken to La Rochelle, where they would be transported to Mississippi. After complaints, the French government prohibited deportations of prisoners to be ordered, but documents show the practice continued until at least 1721. In 1719, Law expanded the bank by buying the East India Company. This company had originally been created by Louis XIV, but had gone bankrupt. All of this initially led to huge speculative investments, driving the share prices up to 10,000 livres. But the bubble burst later that year, with the stock falling to 2,000 by September, 1,000 by December, and all the way back to the original 500 livre price by September of 1721. Law was fired and the Mississippi Company collapsed financially. In order to avoid bankruptcy for all of Law's companies, the French government was forced to issue an indemnity of 514 million livres. This was nearly a quarter of the total French GDP in 1720. The various European claims to land and placement of settlements and settlers, of course, did not come with native agreement. The Natchez people initially welcomed the French, seeing them as potential allies against the Chickasaw, who had recently been acquiring arms from the British. Like all Native American groups, they were ravaged by New World diseases as they increased contact with Europeans, and their relations deteriorated. One of the leaders of the Natchez people was known to the French as Tattooed Serpent. He said the French have, quote, two hearts, a good one today, and tomorrow a bad one. He also said that, quote, before the arrival of the French, we lived like men who could be satisfied with what they have, whereas today we live like slaves, who are not suffered to do as they please. In 1929, the leader of the French garrison of the area was named by the name of Sieur de Chapeau. He was described by one source as rapacious, haughty, and tyrannical. He announced plans to seize lands in the Natchez without payment, and he added that if Natchez protested, he would order his troops to burn down a temple which contained ancestral graves. When some local colonists got word that the Natchez planned an ambush, they tried to warn Chapeau the night before. Reportedly, when they arrived, he was drunk, and so he put some of them in chains. On the morning of November 28, 1729, the Natchez attacked, killing between 150 and 230 people, with estimates that only around 20 French were able to escape. Chapeau was initially taken prisoner with two others, but he was later killed. The fort and the surrounding homesteads were burned. The French responded by sending large numbers of troops, and an open war broke out until the Natchez people were so decimated that they functionally became refugees, living among the Chickasaw and Cherokee of the region. This led to French conflicts that came to be known as the Chickasaw Wars, which greatly disrupted the French growth in the area, while also inadvertently providing the British a buffer in their conflicts. In the Northeast, there was no such buffer between the English and the French holdings. In 1701, the French went to war over the borders of what came known as the Queen Anne's War, and by 1710, the British were able to take control of the provincial capital of Acadia in Port Royal. 3 years later, in 1713, the Peace Treaty of Utrecht was signed, granting the British Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. But control over the land isn't the same as control over people. Many French Acadians allied with the native people against British rule and engaged on raids on British settlements. This eventually led to open conflict starting in 1922 over contested borders which lasted for 3 years. 25 years later, even after the British had built fortifications in nearly every Acadian community, they still lacked full control of the area. Acadian leader Father Jean-Louis Leroutre reportedly said, quote, the English might build as many forts as they pleased, but he wouldn't take care that they should come out of them, for he is resolved to torment them with his Indians. British sources also appear to agree with this assessment, with Administrator Richard Berkeley writing that Nova Scotia, quote, was kept in an uninterrupted state of war by the Acadians, and that an officer commanding Fort Edward could not make it to Halifax unless he had an escort of at least 30 men and an officer. Edward Cornwallis was appointed governor with the instruction to build a new settlement and fortification and take control of the area. He named the settlement Halifax after Lord Halifax, president of the Board of Trade and Plantations, which submitted the plan to the British government. The British demanded the Acadians sign an oath of allegiance to the crown. Some Acadians feared that signing it would lead them to be conscripted to fight the French, or would incite natives to raid their community as they had been raiding the British. Others believed it would be a violation of their Catholic faith, as it included language about the British monarch as the head of the Church of England. But regardless of the reason, many refused, and in 1749, around 1,000 signed a document saying they would leave the country before signing the oath. Some Acadians joined with the native Micmac people in an open rebellion against the British, and by 1755, the British were no longer interested in trying to convince French Acadians to become citizens, as they were in the midst of what was called the 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War in North America. The British instead implemented forced removal programs. Of the estimated 14,500 Acadians still in British territory, 11,500 were deported. Of those, an estimated 5,000 died of disease, starvation, or shipwrecks during the deportation process. Around 1,000 were sent to Maryland, which already had a Catholic population. Most of those settled into Baltimore, creating what became known as Frenchtown. Connecticut was also generally welcoming, with the legislator writing that, quote, Acadians be made welcome, helped and settled under the most advantageous conditions, or if they have to be sent away, measures be taken for their transfer. But the 2,000 who were sent to Massachusetts were far less welcomed, not being allowed to disembark from ships for months, with reports of nearly half dying from cold or starvation on those ships, and those who did survive were being forced into servitude. Pennsylvania similarly refused to allow 500 to disembark for months. Virginia refused to accept those who sent to them, detaining them in Williamsburg, where hundreds reportedly died of malnutrition and disease. Those caught in battle were often sent to the Deep South to work on plantations. Around 1,000 who were destined for France died when 3 transport ships sank in 1758. Although the British did not specifically send Acadians to Louisiana, it became a preferred destination. Many settled along the Mississippi River in an area now sometimes referred to as Acadiana, intermarrying with settlers already present and creating what came to be known as the Cajun culture. By 1762, the French had realized they weren't going to win the war with Britain, and they made a secret agreement to cede the Louisiana Territory to their allies, the Spanish, to assure it didn't fall into British control and remain Catholic after the war. Once the British took control of the land east of the Mississippi and Canada, more Acadians fled to what they believed was the last French strongholds around New Orleans, and they quickly became the largest ethnic group in the area as a result. But as the agreement was not formally announced, many were shocked to find out in 1764 that they were not living in France, but Spain. The Spanish initially left the French governor Jean-Jacques Blaise d'Aubade in place. Even after he died in 1765, another French official, Charles-Philippe Aubry, took over for him, and many citizens of New Orleans sent letters to the king asking him to rescind their agreement and allow them to remain French. But eventually, in 1766, a Spanish governor arrived. His name was Antonio de Ulloa, and he brought only 90 soldiers, presumably expecting the French forces would come to work for the Spanish. But few did. Ulloa's position was so weak, he didn't even attempt to raise the Spanish flag to replace the French one. Ulloa sent letters seeking reinforcements and support from Havana, but it seems the requests were generally ignored. In 1768, Ulloa decided he could wait no longer and attempted to assert Spanish law and authority over the colony. Likely the biggest sticking point was that Spanish law only allowed Spanish colonies to trade with Spain. Ulloa was unsuccessful. On October 28th, riots broke out, and Ulloa was forced to flee the city. In 1769, the Spanish sent 23 ships and nearly 2,000 soldiers. They were led by Alejandro O'Reilly, who took control of the city, lowered the French flag, and raised the Spanish flag, promising, quote, precise justice in dealing with the insurrection. 5 of the ringleaders were arrested, found guilty of treason, and executed by firing squad, and Spanish rule was asserted. Further north on the Mississippi, French fur traders established St. Louis in 1763, not knowing the land was ceded to Spain. Many French who had been living on or near the east bank of the Mississippi decided to relocate as that land was now British, and St. Louis became a destination of choice. It wasn't until 1770 that the Spanish formally took control of St. Louis. By that time, French officials had already given away large numbers of land grants, and the Spanish felt obligated to honor them. When the American Revolution began, both Spain and France supported the Americans against the British, leading the British to attack St. Louis in 1780. The attack was unsuccessful, but the war atmosphere pushed more French to leave the American colonies and move west. In 1789, the French government began to collapse, leading to the French Revolution. But an ocean away, the French settlement of St-Domingue was producing roughly 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the sugar imported into England and France. The population of the settlement was around 452,000, with only 40,000 whites, 28,000 of mixed race, and the rest black slaves. Of these, nearly 2/3 had been brought from Africa rather than being born in the colony, as the brutal conditions meant the death rate of the colony exceeded the birth rate. Hearing of the General Assembly of France passing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, some white planters thought this was an opportunity to seek independence from France. Free people of color on the island viewed things very differently, seeing this as a statement of their equality and demanding things like the right to vote. 2 relatively wealthy merchants of color by the names of Vincent Ange and Jean-Baptiste Chauvin sent a letter to the local governor and assembly demanding the rights of men be extended to free people of color. When the demands were not met, they organized an uprising of around 300 men. The uprising was put down, and Ange and Chauvin were captured, tried, and executed. Ange specifically was executed by being broken on the wheel, with his head paraded on a pike as a warning in early 1791, a warning that seemed to have the opposite effect. On August 21st, 1791, a slave revolt began, and within 10 days the slaves had taken control of a large northern section of the colony. In September, another revolt took control of large cities. Over the next 2 months, at least 4,000 whites were killed, and over 100 sugar and coffee plantations burned. The well-armed whites, who had long prepared for such an event, formed militias which killed around 15,000 blacks, both free and slave. The rebels were not seeking to leave France, but to prevent independence so they could be granted French citizenship. By 1792, they controlled roughly a third of the colony, and in an effort to divide the opposing forces, the Assembly granted full civil and political rights to free blacks in the colony. This, combined with the arrival of 6,000 French troops and an agreement to banish slavery in the northern part of the colony, allowed the French to establish at least some level of control. But when King Louis XVI was executed by the French Republic in 1793, the alliance with the Spanish, who controlled the other half of the island of Hispaniola, collapsed, and many of the white planters, who had been loyal to the king, called for aid from English Jamaica, and all of this combined, of course, destabilized the colony. Fearing a total loss of the colony, the French Republic granted freedom to any slaves willing to fight against the Spanish and the British attempts at occupation, eventually leading to a general emancipation decree for the whole island the following year. But this didn't end suspicion toward the French and the local black population. Over time, the war both on the islands and in Europe was going poorly for the Spanish, who were forced to cede their half of Hispaniola to the French in 1795. Later, in a separate treaty in 1800, they also returned Louisiana back to the French. But fighting continued not just between the French and the British, but also local forces seeking independence from both. General Toussaint Louverture at one point led Spanish forces, stating, quote, "The blacks wanted to serve under a king and the Spanish king offered his protection." While leading Spanish forces, reportedly he said to a crowd, quote, "Brothers and friends, I am Toussaint Louverture. Perhaps my name has made itself known to you. I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in St-Domingue. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourself to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause." Later, he joined with the French, and his forces were able to drive the British off the island. But this alliance was more in word than deed. In 1801, Louverture had issued a new constitution, which made him governor for life, while also calling for a black autonomy and a sovereign black state. By this point, the revolutionary French government had been replaced by a Napoleonic dictatorship. Napoleon sent a large number of forces, led by his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, to retake the island in 1802. Leclerc's forces arrived on February 2, 1802 at the Haitian capital. The Haitian commander, a man by the name of Henri Christophe, refused to surrender to Leclerc, and as a result, the French burned the city to the ground. Leclerc then issued a proclamation that said, "General Toussaint and General Christophe are outlawed. All citizens are ordered to hunt them down and treat them as rebels against the French Republic." Toussaint wrote to one of his generals, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, of a scorched earth plan. He said, quote, "Do not forget, while waiting for the rainy season which will rid us of our foes, that we have no other resource than destruction and fire. Bear in mind that the soil bathed with our sweat must not furnish our enemies with the smallest sustenance. Tear up the roads with shot, throw corpses and horses into all the foundations. Burn and annihilate everything, in order that those who have come to reduce us to slavery may have before their eyes the image of the hell which they deserve." Both sides faced heavy casualties, and the Haitian forces were forced to fall back to guerrilla tactics. When Leclerc made a promise that they would not return to slavery, Christophe and Dessalines changed sides, and eventually Louverture himself surrendered. In addition to the promise to not return to slavery, Louverture was promised that his generals would be able to integrate with the French army, and he himself would be given a plantation. But this was all a lie. Toussaint was imprisoned and sent to France, where he died a few months later. The French, led by Donatin Rochambeau, engaged in mass executions throughout the countryside by means of hanging, firing squads, and drowning bags. There are some reports that Rochambeau came up with a process which he referred to as fumigational sulfurous baths, where hundreds of people were held in holds of ships, and then sulfur would be burned, which created sulfur dioxide, which suffocated them, effectively creating a gas chamber. Through this brutality, the French were able to maintain control for a few months, until their intention to reestablish slavery became clear. And any hope of control was also lost when over 10,000 troops died to yellow fever alone, leaving with only around 8,000 troops total. Napoleon sent another 5,200 Polish troops as reinforcement to put down the restarting rebellion, but many of these troops turned on the French and allied with the Haitians. This led Dessalines, who had once again changed sides to fight against the French, to refer to the Polish as, quote, "the white Negroes of Europe." Leclerc himself died of yellow fever in November of 1802, leaving Rochambeau in charge. Rochambeau reportedly had 15,000 attack dogs imported from Jamaica that had been trained specifically to attack blacks and those of mixed races. Napoleon also sent another 20,000 troops as reinforcement to hold the line. Dessalines also wasn't immune to brutality. He reportedly killed 500 whites and placed their heads on pikes in response. But as the war in Europe expanded, sending additional troops to Haiti became a low priority. And even if troops were available, British blockades would likely have prevented any movement. Defeated and surrounded, Rochambeau eventually surrendered his remaining forces to the British, knowing the alternative would have treated him far worse. Haiti declared independence in 1804. All of this led to the last major migration of French into America, the French who fled from Haiti, often in New Orleans, with their slaves. By 1802, there were 70 sugar plantations, many having been converted from cotton and indigo that was grown before. These new plantations often replicated many of the conditions in Haiti, including having a ratio of black slaves to white planters of roughly 5-1. In 1803, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to America as part of what is now known as the Louisiana Purchase. The new governor of the area, William C.C. Claiborne, spoke neither French nor Spanish and was not Catholic. The migrants from Haiti tripled the free black population of the area, bringing it to around 5,000. But in many ways they had far fewer rights than they had in the French colony, where they were allowed to own not only land but slaves. On January 8, 1811, a slave revolt began at a plantation owned by a man by the name of Manuel Andre. Andre escaped, and reportedly said, quote, "An attempt was made to assassinate me by the stroke of an axe." He went on to say, quote, My poor son has been ferociously murdered by a horde of brigands, who, from my plantation to that of Mr. Fourier, have committed every kind of mischief and excesses, which can be expected from a gang of atrocious bandits of that nature. 15 slaves in the Audrey plantation reportedly marched to a number of plantations, adding slaves as they went, reportedly carrying with them farm implements as weapons, but having few firearms. The planters fled to raise a militia as the march continued between 14 and 22 miles until they built a camp for the night about 15 miles outside of New Orleans, with a group of between 200 and 500 slaves, depending on the account. In response, 2 companies of volunteer militia, 30 members of the volunteer army, and 40 sailors from the Navy moved toward the group, coming from New Orleans. But when they arrived at 4 in the morning, the group had already started moving in the other direction. A second group of 80 men, armed and on horseback, saw the slaves marching and attacked, killing between 40 and 45 of them. The group of slaves dispersed and fled, but they were tracked by both planters and hired Native American trackers. When the supposed ringleader was captured, a naval officer by the name of Samuel Hamilton wrote that after his hands were cut off, he was, quote, then shot in one thigh and then the other, until they were both broken, then shot in the body, and before he had expired, was put into a bundle of straw and roasted. Others who were captured were put on trial, some shot by firing squad, others hanged, most having their heads placed on pikes as warning to others. By January, it was reported there were nearly 100 heads on display in the central New Orleans, where Hamilton said, quote, they were brung up here for the sake of their heads, which decorate our levee, all the way up the coast. I am told they look like crows sitting on long poles. History is awkward.